My guest today is Angela Epstein. Angela is a journalist, broadcaster, and podcaster who has written for the Daily Mail, The Telegraph, and The Times. She is a panelist on Channel 5's Jeremy Vine show and is a frequent debater with appearances on Question Time, This Morning, and Newsnight. Angela, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Angela, in the past, you have been and continue to be fiercely outspoken on anti-Semitism in Britain, be it in politics or social media or wherever it arises, really. And we know that the rates of anti-Semitism have been rising in Britain. And polling by Campaign Against Antisemitism has shown that a shocking 46% of British Jews have said that they don't display visible signs of their Judaism because of anti-Semitism. I'm wondering, what do you make of these trends and why do you think it might be happening?
Well, I think anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred documented in terms of people's disregard, hatred, dislike for cultures that they feel are alien to them. I completely understand why in certain circumstances, loath as we are to admit it, considering our history, that people would want to not display their Jewish credentials. Just by way of anecdote, one of my kids was rounded upon by three Arab-speaking men when he was traveling recently in Europe, who they were staying in the same place, same kind of whatever it was, student hostel or whatever. The night before they'd seen him and he wasn't wearing his kippah, and they were perfectly friendly. And the next day, when they saw him and he was, they rounded upon him. Fortunately, the German police were very good and they have since been arrested. But that, to me, in a nutshell, and that's very personal to me because that happened very recently, displays, and that's a very short version of the story, what happens when you display your Judaism in certain situations. There are lots of people who are amenable and reasonable, but equally, it's an age-old hatred, and we still haven't fathomed out why they don't like us. And loath as I am to be cynical, I'm not surprised by the stats.
That's quite a harrowing story, actually. And I'm just wondering, what do you think attitudes towards Jews in Britain were like when you were younger compared to now? Do you think that your children are facing the same challenges that you may have faced?
I think there's more opportunity because of the number of platforms that there are to express bigoted behaviours and opinions, that our children are more exposed to it. There are more places to engage and there are more places to express how they feel or how other people feel. I don't think Jew hatred, to call it in its sort of crudest and simplistic terms, is massively different to how it ever was. It's obviously been funneled through the issues of what happens in Israel, and you know better than me that you probably see spikes in incidents when there are incursions that happen in Israel and there are incidents elsewhere. I think the otherness of the Jew, if you like, has been written about for generations. In terms of our children, there are just more places now. More kids are going to university from all walks of life. That I think young people are becoming more politicized. And I think there's still a phenomenal amount of ignorance. There's a lot of bandwagonism. And people feel that their bigoted views are legitimized because they are expressed on a university campus or on a social media platform where they might get lots of likes because they hashtag free Gaza without really understanding what the nuances of the Gaza situation is. And I think that's why it's more difficult for our kids.
Now, you've written a lot about anti-Semitism in politics, actually, with recent pieces expressing your fury at your local MP, Christian Wakeford's defection from the Conservatives to the Labour Party. Now, leaving aside his particular trajectory and reasoning for now, our polling shows that over 80% of British Jews still believe the Labour Party is too tolerant of anti-Semitism. Would you share that assessment?
Yeah, most definitely. I really do think, I don't think it can just sort of be that you can detoxify a party which is so deeply entrenched in institutionalized anti-Semitism just by removing a couple of players. They're the likes of, well, there's all sorts of people. Even I think it was at Limud last year, David Lammy, who himself had said some regrettable things, allegedly and proven, came out and said, I'm really sorry post fact. I think Keir Starmer has made a vigorous and robust attempt to try and cleanse the Labour Party of those dark elements. It always concerns me about Starmer that he campaigned for Corbyn, that he would have served under Corbyn, and notwithstanding the fact that we have to sort of move on, and it's very, very sort of commendable that he moved quickly. For example, when Rebecca Long Bailey endorsed a tweet by Maxine Peake, the actress, about the situation in Israel. All of these things sort of show that he's moving, the direction of travel is correct. But I'm not surprised, because I think Labour had swung so far to the hard left. And the irony and great pain for us as Jews is that traditionally Labour was the historic home for Jewish people. It was a refuge for those who felt like the other and the outsider. You know, I was brought up in a family who voted Labour, and I voted Labour for years. Because it spoke to me, and that's part of the pain that we feel, and that's, you know. But I'm not surprised by the stat. No, not at all.
Well, we're also seeing now that with Starmer's increased efforts to tackle anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, there is this increased division among this core of the far left, who will say that the anti-Semitism issue was and still is nothing but a smear. Do you think that they still have any relevance in the Labour Party, or are they just their own thing at this point?
I know from my own experience that if I challenge anybody about Jeremy Corbyn, then Twitter, which I know is an echo chamber and it doesn't reflect absolutely everything, but actually I think Corbyn garnered so much support precisely because Labour was so active on social media. I get absolutely hammered and lambasted, and I'm sure your colleagues have experienced the same thing. When I've challenged fellow panelists on debate programmes about the fact that they once voted for Corbyn and they did endorse him, and even if they've, you know, disregarded him now, and we can have a fairly, reasonable and a robust exchange about that, the venom that this daughter of Zion should come out and criticise Corbyn is absolutely tangible. It's almost like a cult. And I don't know whether it's because people have a vacuum in their lives, whether it's what we come back to at the beginning of the conversation, the age-old anti-Semitism that's, you know, run like a toxic set of letters through a stick of rock all these years and generations. But there's a tremendous amount of feeling still for what Corbyn represented. And you don't get rid of people that easily. When people, as you know yourself, are so deeply entrenched in their beliefs, and it's rocket fueled by the fact that they are so disliking of so many things that Israel or Jews represent, it's very difficult to have a kind of reasonable conversation.
It is. In regard to anti-Semitism in politics, while Labour is still the most extreme case, as it has been for the past few years, other parties are also faring badly. It's not just Labour. You know, the Green Party is now the second party that a majority of British Jews see as too tolerant of anti-Semitism. The Lib Dems and the SNP are performing worse now than in the past. And over a quarter of British Jews say that the Conservatives, who are the party of the government, are too tolerant of anti-Semitism. Do you think that anti-Semitism in politics in general has become worse, or is it just more visible?
I think it's a mixture of things. I think it spirals back to my original point. The greater the number of platforms, the more opportunities you have. That, you know, the larger numbers of the larger the acreage of wasteland that you have, the greater area you have for weeds to grow in it. So obviously, the more we absolutely celebrate free speech in this country. It's a central tenet of a democratic society. What always gets me so kind of depressed about this is so much of it is rooted in either effective propaganda, which propagates itself, if you like, it feeds itself, and the sheer lack of information and knowledge and understanding, and all the things you'll know as the CAA, the completely distorted set of values that go with the way Israel is held to account over certain activities and other countries aren't. as Jews, we absolutely have to hold the Israeli government to account, as we would any democracy or any government, about things that we might question. But as we all know, it's the disproportionate response mixed with the complete lack of knowledge of the geopolitical situation and the platforms that exist. And I'm giving you like the worst recipe for the worst cake you could ever eat. And sprinkle in, like I said, and again, sorry to repeat the point, generations of age-old anti-Semitism and fashionable dinner party anti-Semitism. I'm not surprised.
It seems that more Jewish students are being blamed for the actions of the Israeli government, and there's a lack of distinction being made between the state of Israel and Jews across the world. Has that increased in your lifetime, or has it always been that way?
I think people are more engaged because it comes down. I'm not going to blame communications for everything, but if you think about the way we once digested our news, which is if you missed the 9 o'clock news, you missed it till 10 o'clock on the other side, or you wait for your morning paper to come through your letterbox. News is instant. News is instant, and people engage with that. We've also lost the ability to just be. I'm sorry to sound slightly philosophical. We can't stand in a queue waiting to pay for a packet of crisps without scrolling through our phones. So, and you're going to get pop-ups and flashcards and all sorts of things coming up all the time. Not flashcards, sorry, flash messages. So that we're sort of snagged into debate, even if we don't mean to be. And so I just think there are so many different avenues now to talk about things. And everybody is a citizen journalist now. That's the other thing. You've got a blog, you've got a podcast here, you've got a platform. It doesn't take much to have a platform.
Yes, absolutely. Now, our listeners might be interested to learn that you are of Ukrainian Jewish heritage. Your grandfather fled Ukraine when he was 17 to escape the pogroms, the riots against Jews. What was his story there?
Well, it's quite patchy. And in fact, interestingly enough, my son that I mentioned at the beginning has started to put together a family history. And he's filled in some of the blanks. And the irony of his unfortunate incident in Germany is that he'd gone to Germany to sort of look more into the history of the Holocaust and see some of the sort of historical artifacts, visit the camps, etc., which is what made the incident that he had to be exposed to all the more painful, if you like. Setting aside that, my grandpa was called Azriel Fairman, and he came from a small village, we think near the Dnieper River in Ukraine. And obviously the family sensing the urgency to leave because of the pogroms, because of this unreconstructed hatred that was going on and the danger it posed, they scrambled together enough money for my grandfather Azriel and for a cousin. And from what I understand, because nobody could just come here without having some kind of connection. I don't know how they made the journey, but they made it to the UK. And one cousin went to Sheffield, where there was some family, and the other was sent via London. It was suggested he came to Manchester, where there was a burgeoning Jewish community. A lot of Jewish industrialists were here. Obviously, Manchester was the great industrial city. And he came here, he boarded with a family and met my grandmother, who was one of the members of this family. He was a terrific musician. He was the choir master at the shul, the synagogue here in North Manchester, where I live. And he was, unfortunately, I never met him, but he had bright red hair, which apparently was quite predominant in the village that he came from. And as you can see, because I'm worth
Yes.
it, this is not L'Oreal. This is pure Ukrainian. Sorry, but for those that are listening rather than seeing, I have got red hair.
I can confirm her hair is very red. Now, knowing that your grandfather left Ukraine to escape persecution, I'm wondering how, if at all, does that affect the way that you're seeing the current situation between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, yes, absolutely. I think Jewish people have a complicated history with Ukraine because, on the one hand, every generation, to quote Mike and the Mechanics, for those who know their pop music, blames the one before. And the Ukraine of the turn of the century and of the war years, pre-war and during the Second World War, is not the Ukraine we know now. It has a Jewish president, as we know. It's a very tolerant place. There's a huge number of Jewish people that live there. But equally, my grandfather fled his countrymen, the Jews of Ukraine, that couldn't get out during the Second World War. Many were brutalized by Ukrainians. So that we have to set aside. That was the history. I'm mindful now that we are all human beings, and we are a collective big society. And it's just astonishing in the age that we live now, and I'm not the first person to say this, that we are seeing people fleeing for their lives. They're fleeing for very different reasons. They're ultimately fleeing a brutalizing dictator. Sorry to use the word twice, but it's a different kind of thing. But Putin is not. He's not focusing on the Jews. He's focusing on anybody who gets in his way. But equally, it does have there's an extra pang of sorrow for all people, whatever their religious ethnicity or whatever their religious background, are fleeing at the moment. Yes, it feels very difficult for them.
It does. It does. And, amidst this invasion, we have seen an influx of rhetoric surrounding Nazis and the Holocaust. And you recently wrote a piece, I believe it was for The Independent, discussing people's comparisons between Putin and Hitler. I was wondering if you could give us your take on that.
Yes, I would. If I could just add, by the way, about my grandfather, he never surrendered the gratitude he felt to the UK for offering him a place of refuge and sanctuary. He never saw his family again. That was a source of great sort of unspoken sorrow. The letters that came through were heavily censored, and they were written in some kind of Hebrew that was transliterated into Yiddish or vice versa. But he immediately became naturalized. He was a stretcher bearer in the First World War. He felt a very strong affinity. And I think then that in itself, again, is different to the way people are now in Ukraine. They want to be Ukrainian. They're proud of their country and they want to stay where they are. And I'm very mindful of the difference in that experience and being forced from their homes when they want to stay. And that's one of the differences in when I think it's a very lazy get out of jail card to compare Putin and Hitler. Yes, two dictators who have absolutely no recourse to the value and sanctity of human life in order to achieve their ideological aims. This much is true. This much makes very much for a parallel sort of description. But I think we do a disservice to the victims of both if we lump them together in one big kind of club for dictators. For the reasons I've said about Putin a moment ago, about the fact that his ideology is about Russia. It's not anybody is cannon fodder to him, both but giving and receiving, if he's going to try and somehow regroup the great former glory of the Soviet Union pre the fall of communism. We must not move away from the singularity of the Holocaust. The Holocaust stands out in the annals of human history as the most extraordinary, unimaginable act of inhumanity against human beings. Every man, all the things we know, every man, woman, child, unborn child, elderly person, anybody who was defined as being Jewish, as set out in the terms agreed at the Wannsee Conference, was a candidate for the gas chamber. And Hitler had no consideration about what people had given to Germany. You had people who had fought on Germany's side in the First World War. It didn't matter. He wanted to eradicate the Jewish race, and this was a civilized, westernized, so-called cultured country who, on every level, somehow were able to abandon all that rationale and just reduced Jews to nothing more than vermin that had to be annihilated, but also the savagery with which it was done, the glee and the brutality that was given an opportunity to express itself because of Hitler's ideology and the Nazi ideology. And that's why I think it's very different. In recent times, we saw Putin kind of headlining a rally. I don't know if you saw the pictures. He had some kind of Nuremberg-style rally, I think, to showcase to the world that he has the support of Russia, because the PR, as much as anything else, is so poor. And again, there is a rush to say he is Hitler. Certainly, the rally was very Nuremberg-esque, massive sort of stage set for huge numbers of people to fly the Z flag and show their support. But I think it is very important that we do not in any way compare Putin to Hitler.
Now, Jews as a race, as an ethnic group, is a topic that you have written about before, and you say that Jews are an ethnic minority, no matter what the national census or the BBC say. Why do you think it's important to educate people about this?
Because I think we have to recognize and understand that Jews come from sort of over 5,000 years of history. We have traditions that endure today, regardless of where you live in the world, that date back thousands of years. If you think about the scrolls that are read, when people read out a portion of the law, the Torah, on Saturday, on Shabbat, as we call it, it's the same whether you're reading it in France, you are reading it in medieval Britain, where these traditions and these cultures bind us together in a way that distinguishes us from other things. And that's why, as a group, I think as a homogenous group, that ethnicity brings us together in a way that defines who we are.
Right, and another thing that defines who we are is oftentimes our names, because our surnames are quite distinctive. And this is another thing that you've written about your surname Epstein, and how it might be viewed differently in and outside of the Jewish community. For example, Jews may inquire if you're related to other Epsteins in Manchester. I think you said, "Do you know the wine merchants or something?" And the answer is inevitably no. And whereas people outside of the Jewish community might be quicker to associate the name Epstein with Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender. And you've also written about how Jeremy Corbyn's pronunciation of Jeffrey Epstein during a national election debate made you feel quite uncomfortable. What are some of the ways do you think that your surname has played a role in your life in a way that more quote-unquote British names like Smith or Johnson may not have?
Well, I think for anybody that knows anything about Jewish people, even if they're very remotely touched by the world, Epstein is saying, hello, I've got a Jewish surname, in the way that other surnames relating to other groups would flag up that they have a certain heritage and background and culture. And I've always been very proud of it. I've never hidden my Judaism. I've never sort of felt the need to, because I am entirely defined by it, not because I'm as an extreme example of an observant Jew. I'm a traditional observer of Judaism, but Epstein is something that very much is almost like when you recognize the red and white insignia on a tin of Coca-Cola. It's saying, I am Jewish. Want a better description. I loved it also because when I was about 15, even though it was way after they'd disbanded, I discovered the Beatles. And I thought they sound quite good, don't miss much. And I discovered that their manager was called Brian Epstein. So I loved that. And then there was Jacob Epstein, the sculptor. I loved the fact that I could connect with other Epsteins, or also it was a way of saying to other Jewish people who met me for the first time, perhaps in a very secular situation, might have been a group of people waiting to be interviewed at a university or whatever it is. It's like, Cooey, one of us, who do you know?
Right.
The Hebrew word mishpacha, which means family. So there is the notion of the mishpachology, making the degrees of separation. What I fought with for years was the mispronunciation. Because of the way it's spelt, there was a presumption that it was Stein, as in Steinway piano. And so I've actually always had to say, whenever I've done television debates, it's Epstein. And actually, one television host, who shall remain nameless, actually had to have it written out phonetically on the auto cue because they kept getting it wrong. So they put Epstein with 3 E's so that there was no way to mispronounce it. And for those prices as well. But anyway, so there was a moment when Jeremy Corbyn obviously referred to Jeffrey Epstein as Epstein, and I felt that was his way of saying, because nobody else had referred to the convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein as Stein, oh, and he's Jewish as well. So that was almost sort of played beautifully into the Corbyn handbook of looking for ways to express his particular ideologies and views of Jewish people, allegedly. But Jeffrey Epstein, there is nothing redeemable about what he did or the way he behaved. Utterly heinous behaviour. The only slightly observation I would make is that suddenly people were pronouncing the name properly. But equally, the problem that I had, it's not really a problem, but you're a commentator on a television program that's discussing the news of the week about the hateful behaviour of Jeffrey Epstein. Angela Epstein, what do you think about this? And you have to go, oh, yeah, no relation,
Yeah.
because the name is quite sort of distinctive. But I'm proud of it. It's not it's my single name. I'm married, but I work in my single name because I'm proud of the name, and I want to align myself with it.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I like the idea that it's sort of a, like you say, a subtle way of saying to other Jews, hey, just so you know, we're
here.
we're
And the
here.
other thing I would say I wear it because I like it, but for those that are watching on on YouTube, I have my name in Hebrew around my neck, which was just a present my husband bought me a few years
Oh,
ago. I
that's
just happened
lovely.
to like it, but it's very pretty. It's very nice. But to somebody who's missed the Epstein connection, they see it and they go, "Yep." Or sometimes you get on Twitter, that redhead that was spouting rubbish on the telly yesterday. Was that she's got that Hebrew necklace around her neck. I don't mind. I've got very thick skin.
Now, on the topic of anti-Semitism in culture and politics, you speak about this a lot. You've also spoken about anti-Semitism in sports. When Sheffield United became the only club in the Premier League not to adopt the international definition of anti-Semitism, you called the club out for double standards, but you also wondered about how effective past anti-racism campaigns in football have really been. What was it about Sheffield that disappointed you so much? And do you think things are getting better in football?
Well, Sheffield didn't seem to have a convincing reason not to do it. What can be more simple than joining an international movement to help people understand what anti-Semitism is, how we define it, just as much so that we don't spoil for an argument over little things that aren't really anti-Semitic, because the big stuff is so important. And therefore, why did they feel so disposed towards not embracing it, and not feeling that they should join so much of the footballing community in doing so? Football's had a very nasty relationship with racism, not just anti-Semitism, all forms of racism, and football itself has held campaigns in order to try and fight that. And I just couldn't understand the thinking behind it. I mean, I'm the first to say, not every expression of, I don't want to look for anti-Semitism where I don't think it exists. Can't remember how many months ago it was, Amazon pulled the insignia, I think it is, you might have to correct me on the complete details, of it might have been their online packaging, the little Amazon signal. It's
Yeah.
packaged with an arrow, that works as a kind of smiley face, because there was a suggestion it looked like Hitler, and they didn't want to offend anybody. And I wrote a piece for the Times about, I'm not offended. Don't use up your energy on the small stuff. That kind of the spoiling for an argument. And I felt that with Sheffield. I couldn't understand why they found it so difficult to break away from such an important cause.
Yeah. What do you think about anti-Semitism in football more in general? Because we've had the kick it out campaigns, and recently Spurs have moved to ban the Y word. It looks like they're going to do that. Have you noticed a difference in anti-Semitism and how it's viewed in football?
Well, some footballers are more switched on than others. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. And some of them are probably not thinking too deeply on the event. When you get mass crowds who are bunched together, as we've seen in all sorts of situations, then you get a kind of obviously get a physical Mexican wave, but you can get a Mexican wave in terms of the language and the narrative. And it just becomes it just feeds itself. And I think as soon as, it's like joining in the songs on the terraces. Before you know it, people are sort of shouting stuff, and they don't half the time they don't even know what it means. And because it's so unreconstructed, and because it's an opportunity to do this in a huge environment, then yeah, it's just another platform. It's a platform we've talked about before. When Marcus Rashford was photographed recently with Wiley, I don't know if you remember this, who, he didn't do it because he wanted to ally himself with somebody who had been called out for expressing various anti-Semitic comments. He did it because it was Wiley. And in fairness to Marcus Rashford, he does a tremendous amount of good for all sorts of elements of the broader community. Yeah, he reacted fairly quickly to that, which to me, in a nutshell, expressed how difficult it is to get the information across. I don't think they're that nuanced and switched on. Football is about money and winning. It's tribal. Everything's very black and white. That wasn't a pun. I mean it in general terms, that, you're in or you're out. You're a red or you're a blue. It is not, the terraces are not the place for a nuanced debate. And that's not a reason that we mustn't approach it and find a way to deal with it. But we need to deal with it in the broadest terms that make it accessible for people to digest the message.
Now, I don't just want everyone to think that all you do is talk about anti-Semitism, because you don't. You talk about other things. And in addition to being a writer and broadcaster, as you mentioned, you're a podcaster. You co-host the podcast Jewish Mother Me, which is described as, and I quote, a brutally honest but nearly always humorous look at the world of the Jewish mother. Angela, for any listeners who may not be acquainted with the term Jewish mother, how would you describe this term?
Okay. Well, I think to describe it, I need to describe the provenance of the podcast. Huge klaxon alert. It is not a parenting podcast. If you are looking for advice about how to get a baby to sleep through the night or what to do about nappy rash, please move on, because you will not find it on our podcast. We are three girls who've been friends for many, many years, who were brought up by very different but very influential to us Jewish mothers. We've known lots of strong Jewish mothers who've passed down wisdom, but also we recognise some of the sort of quirks that go with the Jewish mother characteristic. And we just thought, wouldn't it be great to bring that all together in a podcast, get people, well-known people, to talk about their Jewish mothers, also Jewish mothers who'd had a different Jewish mothering experience, not well-known people. It might be how years after a stillbirth, how that's affected the way they've become a Jewish mother, or how they were Jewish mothered in difficult situations. The common denominator, as you say, is the Jewish mother. So the stereotype of the Jewish mother has always been the fearsome matriarch who will fight like a lioness to protect her own. She will smother you with love. She will want to feed you until you can't move. She will be there for you under every set of circumstances. And then there's all the humorous stuff, the guilt tripping and the excessive sort of ambition, all of those things. It's a multitude of things. I think Jewish mothers do come in all shapes and sizes, but we use that as our starting point because she seemed to have such a distinctive role in culture, in the Jewish and non-Jewish world. And we began to talk about the fact, because she is this person, could everybody do? The idea was Jewish mothers, should every home have one? Not specifically a Jewish mother, but some of the things that she represents. So, for example, one of the podcasts we devoted our attention to was Friday Night Dinner, not the comedy program, but the concept of Friday Night Dinner, because it's interesting that you'll get Jewish people who can be entirely disenfranchised. That's entirely their choice how they want to express their Judaism or not. But you offer a Friday night dinner and they are there like a rocket. The idea of sitting around the table with hot steaming bowls of chicken soup and freshly baked challah, the plaited traditional Jewish bread, and it's the end of the week, and lively conversation in which everything is up for debate. Lots of non-Jewish friends and colleagues over the years who've had Friday night dinner either with me or with other friends have absolutely loved it. So we looked at it and we thought, Friday night dinner, should every home have one? Might not be Friday night, might be another night of the week, but make it a night when your phone is off, the telly's off, you get a big pot of something you can all eat together. Chicken soup is a fabulous example of that. And see how it can really enhance and uplift your week, and we talked about all the Friday nights we'd had over the years. There'd always be one of us would always be thrown out of the room when we were brought up, because it's also a time when people argue. So that was the idea of the podcast, bringing a bit of that Jewish motherness into people's lives, because there are so many people that feel disassociated, not just from religion, from all sorts of things. They feel separate from their communities. There's a lot of dysfunctional family life because people, marital breakups, people living apart from others because of commercial needs or whatever. So it's like, it would be great to have that somebody or something in your life that will make you feel comforted. That was the idea.
Yeah, that's absolutely a lovely idea. It's also worth mentioning that this Sunday is Mother's Day, so shout out to all the Jewish mothers out there.
Absolutely. And if they don't get you a card,
Take care of your Jewish mothers.
It's like the old joke, how many Jewish mothers does it take to change a light bulb? None, I'll just sit here in the dark.
I don't want to be a fuss. Now, you mentioned Friday night dinner, the dinner, but also let's talk about Friday night dinner, the show. There was a bit of controversy over the casting of that when with Tamsin Gregg, who is the mum in the show, and she is not Jewish. And there's a bit of controversy over whether she should have played the Jewish mother role, or whether that role should have just been played by a Jewish woman. And more broadly, should all Jewish characters be played by Jews? What do you think about that?
Well, Tamsin Gregg actually said it was a postscript to her world of her work on Friday Night Dinner, that perhaps it should have gone to a Jewish actress. And then subsequently, Maureen Lipman said more recently that she expressed an opinion about whether Golda Meir, who's going to be portrayed in a forthcoming movie, the part should have gone to a Jewish actress. It actually went to Helen Mirren. And that created a whole discussion about the concept of the so-called Jew face. If somebody is Jewish or looks Jewish, does that mean that they should be the ones that get the so-called Jewish parts? I don't know if you sort of picked up on this. Maybe I'm just too tired, but I hate somebody who spends a lot of time debating as part of their work. I loathe spoiling for an argument where there isn't necessarily a need for one, because first of all, it takes away from the big stuff and you don't get taken seriously. I think we have got so many brilliant actresses and actors out there, and here's a clue: it's acting. So if you can give a convincing portrayal of that person, then I don't care who plays it. I think it's almost tokenistic to say only Jewish people should get that role. It may well be that a Jewish person may play it better because they haven't got to do learned behaviors. We have, without stereotyping, certain nuances, certain ways of acting, the way we move our hands. I listened to Maureen Lipman give a very robust defense of her position. She'd said something like, forgive me, Maureen, if I'm not quoting you directly, something like only Hilda from Hendon will get what Hilda from Hendon should look like on the screen. But equally, we have gay actors who have played straight roles. We have had, I think that the importance is that you don't see the join. And if you do, I thought Tamsin Gregg was in fact Jewish, and it was fine, no problem. I have a greater beef where there's an attempt to burnish right on credentials for the sake of it, and it comes back to my views about spoiling for an argument. So, should the next James Bond be a woman? Well, Ian Fleming clearly wrote the part in his novels. It was a man. If you're talking about a lack of decent roles for women, write more roles for women. Why should they have cast-offs from, the entrails from Ian Fleming's table? Write better roles for women. Would you want the role of Stevie Wonder in a biopic to be played by a white man? Well, of course you couldn't. And you wouldn't do something so offensive as to, we're past the days of the black and white minstrel show, which, that was deeply offensive, where people would black up to look like a character, somebody who was Afro-Caribbean, who was black. Absolutely. The issue about acting is to be able to be convinced, to suspend belief about your outside world and be entirely convinced about what you're watching. And that's why I thought it was an entirely unnecessary argument.
Yeah. Now, back to you. You are actually quite an active member of your community. You are a member of Yom HaShoah Manchester. It's a charity which organises the Greater Manchester Jury's annual Holocaust Remembrance event. And we know that sadly the number of Holocaust survivors are becoming fewer. And with that comes is going to come a lack of first-hand testimonies. With this in mind, what do you think is the future of Holocaust remembrance?
Well, it's a question that troubles lots of people, not necessarily those who've got specific jobs within the community, but just in general. As I said to you before, Ellie, the Holocaust for all communities, it was a human catastrophe. It was a Jewish catastrophe first and foremost, but it was a human catastrophe because it showed what man is capable of in terms of his treatment of fellow men. And so there is nothing more powerful than human testimony, than first-hand testimony. I still feel when I meet a Holocaust survivor, and obviously I've met many, it's been a privilege to meet many over the course of my involvement with Yom HaShoah in Manchester. I just look at them and I think, I can't believe what you have seen, what there is in your mind when you lie down at night and think and reflect on things. That number on your arm means you were there in Auschwitz. When I went to visit Auschwitz, I couldn't get it almost. It was almost looked too much like a movie set because I've seen it so often as a movie set. But so there is a tremendous difficulty. So we have to record as much as we can, and we have to find other ways to tell the story. So we tell it through the second generation. We tell it through the children of Holocaust survivors who talk about what it was to what their parents represented. And we just have to find a way to not drop the baton, to continue to read the books, show the films, stamp out Holocaust denial, which is as much of a battle as it is as to try and find ways to record the Holocaust because of our dwindling number of survivors. And we think about it very much now. We put on this annual event in Manchester. We get up to about 1,000 people. Yom HaShoah is World Jewry's Day to remember the Holocaust. It was chosen by the Israeli government because it was on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and reminds us that that Jews are here, that we live on. We don't just memorialize the survivors, but we memorialize the 6 million who were murdered, but we honor the survivors. And we'll have to look to other ways to educate. There's obviously going to be, in the gardens of Westminster, there will be a Holocaust Memorial and Education Centre, and we have to just keep showing the footage, talking about the stories, talking about what happened. We still study Henry VIII. I mean, you look at Henry VIII, not wishing to be trivial, but you look at a history syllabus, you'd think the only king that had ever been was Henry VIII. That we'll have to use those educational tools that keep the Tudors and the Stuarts alive to find a way to tell the story of the Holocaust.
Absolutely. Angela, I really want to thank you for coming on Podcast Anti-Semitism. Before we wrap up, please tell our listeners where they can find you, what you've got coming up, what you want them to know.
Oh, that's very kind. Well, first of all, to sort of go backwards, forwards, Yom HaShoah, which different communities will be marking across the country on April the 26th and 27th this year. Here in Manchester, Yom HaShoah Manchester is staging its Yom HaShoah commemoration at the Bridgewater Hall in the centre of the city. Admission is free, but you can book online if you want to reserve a seat. And we take a theme each year because the subject is just so big. And that's another way to sort of commemorate. So this year, because it's at the Bridgewater and it's a concert venue, we're looking at the music of the Holocaust. And the programme is entitled Notes on Sorrow and Survival, looking at how musicians were caught up in those murderous years, performing for Nazis, performing outside concentration camps, those who use music to express their freedom. So that's at the Bridgewater Hall on the 27th of April. You can go to www.yomhashoahmanchester.org to find out more. Jewish Mother Me you can find across all platforms, Spotify, etc. And you'll find out the whole back catalogue of episodes, and we've got some interesting guests coming up, so watch this space. And do engage with us on Instagram and Facebook if you've got Jewish mothers you want to talk about or you've known. And as I say every time on the podcast, you don't have to be Jewish. I was going to say it in that terrible voice. And you know what? I said to you earlier on, we're all lots of citizens journalists out there. I would just say to everybody, don't hesitate to use your platform for the good. You don't have to be Jewish. You don't have to be a journalist to get out there and call it out for what it is. I'll continue to use the privilege of my position to call it out when I see it and to know when to spoil for the fight and when not. And you know, hopefully we'll come to a place where we're all human beings. Life is short. Let's just have great respect for human life, whichever star you were born under, and I'll continue to write about that.
Amen. Angela Epstein, thank you so much for chatting with me on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure.